Welcome to Convict Lives Australia. Today we are visiting the Gisborne Cemetery in central Victoria, part of the Macedon Ranges Shire, to visit the final resting place of a Scottish convict who was transported to Australia at the age of 16 for his part in the theft of a gown. His name was James Banigan. Now thankfully it's autumn in Australia, so there are no magpies swooping, but there were a lot of magpies in this cemetery, which was, I don't know, a little bit strange, but anyway, they were kind of looking at me and I was like, Anyway, so James was born in the village of Hamilton in Scotland in 1829. Now Hamilton was a market town about a day's walk southwest of Edinburgh. At just 16 years of age, James was tried at the Edinburgh Court of Sessions on the 12th of May 1845 for his part in stealing a gown, along with two other boys, a John Short and a John Riddle. Now James had 3 prior convictions and some jail time, so he received 10 days jail for stealing knives and forks, 30 days for stealing half a block of cheese, and 12 months for stealing a handkerchief. It is interesting to learn that James could read and write, suggesting he had received some education. He may have become an orphan, which in turn led him onto the streets of Edinburgh. His criminal history certainly does support that theory. Or perhaps his parents had forced him onto the streets to thieve to help sustain the family, which unfortunately was quite a common occurrence in those days. Now, James received a 7-year transportation sentence and he was put onto the transportation ship the Equestrian, and he arrived in Van Diemen's Land 5 months later, and the surgeon's report recorded that he was very well behaved. James was recorded as a Roman Catholic and he was 4'9" and he had a scar on the right side of his forehead. He had 2 ring tattoos on the ring fingers of both hands and a star with 7 dots and the name J. Branchen, or was it Banigan? It could have been misread, and I'm sure it wasn't a professional tattoo like we see today. So convicts did sometimes tattoo their own initials and names on themselves. And the name and the 7 dots were tattooed down his left wrist. And those tattoos actually came in very handy later on when identifying him in the Victorian criminal records. Upon arrival in Tasmania, James was taken to Point Puer on the Tasman Peninsula near Port Arthur. Now Point Puer, and I hope I am saying this correctly, I did listen to a YouTube video of a lecture about the subject and this is how the narrator pronounced it. So Puer, so P-U-E-R, and Puer is a Latin word meaning boy or young man. Now it was the site of the first purpose-built juvenile reformatory in the British Empire. Established in 1834, it housed some 3,000 boys in its lifetime, aged between 9 and 18, who had been convicted of crimes in Britain and transported to Australia. The jail aimed to separate these young convicts from the adult prison population and provide them with education and vocational training. Despite its progressive intentions, life at Point Puer was harsh, with strict discipline and hard labour being the norm. The institution operated until 1849 and its remains are now part of the Port Arthur historic site. Author of the book The Lost Boys of Mr. Dickens, How the British Empire Turned Artful Dodgers into Child Killers, Steve Harris, described Point Puer as the stuff of a Dickens novel. A boys' town created by the pride and justice at the heart of a mighty empire, its most remote outpost housing a generation of boys stolen away from whatever passed for their childhood and families. Here they were expediently dispatched out of mind and sight to the last inhabited landform before Antarctica, where, off limits to anyone but a few approved visitors, the chain of Her Majesty's Justice would employ severe discipline and punishment to perhaps save some and set them on the right path. The following information comes from the work of historians Peter McPhee, Robin McLaughlin and Malcolm Matthias, or Matthias, I apologise if I'm saying that wrong, which can be accessed online, and it's the Point Puer lads, tried and transported. The Point Puer lads and their prison 1833 to 1849. Now, before the establishment of Point Puer, boys were already being transported to the colonies, with an experimental group sent in 1830. Lieutenant Governor George Arthur, concerned about the influence of experienced criminals on young convicts in Hobart, saw them as a burden on the government. Many of these boys were London street orphans or had been led into crime by their parents. And Governor Arthur, or George Arthur, viewed them with compassion and sought to reform them through training and punishment at Point Puer. Now, Commandant Charles O'Hara Booth was tasked with setting up the settlement, and the first group of boys arrived in January of 1834, albeit in a drunken state after breaking into wine during their journey. Oh dear. Most of the convict youths at Point Puer came from large industrial cities and towns in England, Scotland, and to a lesser extent Ireland. These areas experienced extreme poverty and due to a lack of work and changing work patterns, leading to high crime rates. The first superintendent of Point Puer was a Mr. Montgomery, and he was an alcoholic, and he was appointed in the hopes of his redemption. I mean, honestly. However, his continued drinking and abusive behaviour towards his wife proved disastrous. I mean, he would have been the worst example for the young boys. Anyway, staffing at Point Puer was a persistent issue, with most overseers being well-behaved convicts from Point Arthur, supervising the boys in trade and gang work. Only the senior officials were free. The moral and religious training of the boys at Point Puer was overseen by a catechist or lay preacher. This role was crucial in providing guidance and instilling values in the young convicts. The following information comes from a Tasmanian Times article written by Callum J. Jones in 2020. And here you can see the schedule the boys followed during the week. And on Sundays, they did follow the same routine until breakfast. At 10:30am, they then attended a church service. Sunday school was held after lunch. They then had to attend another church service at 6pm. At Point Puer, boys received basic schooling, religious teaching and training in various trades. Initially, they performed heavy and unskilled labour such as cutting wood, cleaning and loading ships. Well-behaved boys could choose a trade to learn, including carpentry, shoemaking, tailoring, labouring, bookbinding, boat building, bookbinding, that's interesting, I probably have chosen that one, and stonemasonry. Younger boys who served longer apprenticeships benefited the most. Misbehaving boys faced tough punishments like confinement, loss of privileges and caning. Now, this was a typical day's offence list, and notice there was more misconduct in the chapel than there was using bad language, which was interesting, and rolling a government cask into the sea. Okay, interesting. And fighting looked like to have the most number of cases on that day, which is to be expected, with all the boys living together like that. Now, William Champ was a supervisor of the convicts for a time, and he described Point Puer as a wretched, bleak, barren spot without water, wood for fuel, or an inch of soil. Point Puer was located on an inaccessible point of land with a 60-foot cliff on its western side and treacherous currents around Opossum Bay, making it an ideal prison. Only 3 boys ever successfully escaped. The prison buildings were simple and hastily constructed, with handmade bricks and no lime in the mortar, leading to rapid deterioration. Steve Harris at the Sydney Morning Herald wrote, "Juvenile transportees, if they survived to age 20, had an average lifespan of 55 years, 7 less than the average Tasmanian male." McPhee, McLaughlin and Matthias go on to explain, upon arrival, boys were initially tasked with the hard work of learning to use the spade, the hoe and the grubbing axe. The better behaved boys were then given the opportunity to become tradesmen. The aim of trade training was supposedly to equip the teenage convicts with skills for future employment. By 1837, trades included carpentry, sawing, tailoring, stone cutting, shoemaking, baking and cooking for a small group, nail making and blacksmithing. James received training in boot and shoemaking. Due to his good behaviour, he was selected to further his studies and enhance his prospects in the shoemaking business. James Ross, a visitor to the prison in 1837, noted that the boys evidently took delight in their labours and provided the following description. But it must be noted that in 1837 the population at Point Puer was less than 230 boys, providing a better opportunity for a boy to learn a trade and less strain on facilities compared to later years. Now 1837 is when James Banigan would have been there. And James Ross writes, "The scene that presented itself to us as we landed at Point Puer was most gratifying. Although the same silence met us at the Port Arthur settlement and the effects of crime still cast an overwhelming cloud over all of the youth, the little fellows evidently took delight in their labour. Close by the wharf where we landed, like sailors at a capstan," whatever that means, but anyway, "they were hauling up heavy logs of timber from the beach and placing them on saw pits. Further on, carpenters or house builders were sawing, cutting and nailing away as fast as their hands would allow. Others were hoeing and weeding in the vegetable garden. Our large room was filled with little shoemakers," that's our James, "as busy as bees, and another adjacent room housed little tailors making sheepskin clothes. We inspected their sleeping quarters, which was a large and roomy loft running the length of the eating room below. It was remarkably clean and convenient, with each boy sleeping apart, divided from the others by wooden partitions. The sound of the supper bell caught our ear, and the boys marched in with great regularity. After a short prayer, they all commenced eating, not a word or sound of any kind being heard the whole time. That is far from normal or something to delight in." In 1839, a man named Laplace noticed the boys eating silently and earnestly, but he also noted that several constables of forbidding countenance were walking about with a whip in their hand. And I'd say this is the more likely reason the boys were so quiet. Their behaviour was far from normal. They had been institutionalised, banished from their homelands, and any example of what normal relationships, friendships, and family looked like. Many would go on to suffer from all sorts of issues as a result as they grew older. In December of 1848, James received his PPH third class, meaning his probation pass. A third-class probation pass holder was the initial and most restrictive class. Convicts in this class had the least amount of freedom and were subject to the strictest conditions. They had to work under close supervision and had limited opportunities for earning wages. As convicts demonstrated good behaviour and completed certain requirements, they could progress to second and eventually first class, each offering more freedom and better conditions. This allowed James to travel to Hobart and secure work as a shoemaker. His first job was with a man named Thomas Jones. Though the exact location is unclear due to impossible to read handwriting on his record. By April he was employed by Simon Fraser in Hobart, where he received 6 days in solitary confinement for drunkenness. This initial punishment hints at a struggle that would later become a raging demon in James's life. In May of that year, he received a ticket of leave. A ticket of leave was a significant milestone for male convicts in Tasmania. It granted them a degree of freedom, allowing them to work for wages, choose their own employers, and live independently within a specified district. This semi-freedom was a reward for good behaviour and often marked the beginning of a convict's reintegration into society. However, it came with strict conditions. Convicts had to report to authorities, attend church services, and could be recalled to full servitude if they violated any terms. For many, it was a crucial step towards eventual pardon and a new life, offering a glimmer of hope and a chance to rebuild their lives after years of hardship. James behaved himself for over a year, and he likely worked as a shoe and boot maker in Hobart until October of 1850, when he was punished with 14 days of solitary confinement at the Hobart Barracks for being out after hours and posing as a free man. Sometime after this, he moved to Longford, just south of Launceston. He was reprimanded for being in the district without reporting himself, but no punishment was given. A year later, he was fined 5 shillings for drunkenness. In May of 1852, James received his Certificate of Freedom, having completed his 7-year transportation sentence. A Certificate of Freedom was a crucial document for male convicts in Tasmania, marking the end of their servitude and the start of a new chapter. Issued once they completed their sentence, it officially recognised them as free individuals, no longer bound by the restrictions of their convict status. This certificate allowed them to move freely, seek employment, and even return to the United Kingdom if they could afford the journey. Most couldn't. We know that James was still in Tasmania in July of 1854 because he was fined 5 shillings at the Launceston Petty Sessions for being drunk in a street. Sometime after 1854, however, he made his way to Victoria. Did he venture to the goldfields in search of fortune? Or did he follow the masses, heading to the Victorian colony, knowing they would all need shoes and shoe repairs, hoping to make his fortune that way? The first record we have of James in Victoria is in 1863. He would have been 35 years old. And according to a city police report in the Age newspaper, James Banigan and James Rule were charged with being illegally on the premises of James Lang. There's a whole lot of Jameses happening here. On Swanson Street in Melbourne. They pleaded drunkenness and poverty, explaining that they had no money and sought shelter in an empty house. They were cautioned and subsequently discharged. Sometime after this, James made his way to Daylesford. We know that he was working for a man named Patrick Casey because in April of 1877, James was charged with making use of threatening language towards a woman named Ellen Casey. There was a write-up of the incident in the Kyneton Guardian on Wednesday, April the 11th in 1877, under the heading Threatening Language. James Banigan, spelt wrong, alias Scott, so James may have been using an alias as a way of hiding his convict past, maybe even to obtain employment, was charged with using abusive language and threatening language to Ellen Casey, with intent to provoke a breach of the peace. Mrs. Casey deposed that the defendant had been in her husband's employ, and on Tuesday the 27th he was discharged and settled up with. Maybe his drinking was making him unreliable. It's possible. So after taking what was coming to him, he complained that Casey had charged him 2 shillings a week more for his board than a previous man had been charged. He swore he would have revenge before night, and in the evening come back with an armful of stones. James! Oh, and he called her a bitch, and an Irish bitch, no less, and he threatened to scatter her brains about the place and to scalp her. Oh dear. Oh God. He also threatened that he would burn the house about her ears. And in reply to a Mr. Godwin, who was defending James, Ellen denied that she had commenced the affray by throwing a last at James. So I had to look that one up. A last is a shoemaker's tool, specifically a solid form. Like this image. She also denied that her husband had chased him about the place with a boot key. Again, I've had to look like what a boot key was. Boot keys were used by shoemakers to stretch the material, the leather, for the boots, etc. And I'm not sure how accurate this image is actually. I found it very hard to find an image, so I had to go to the old ChatGPT, and that's what they've given me. So please don't, I'm not sure if that's accurate. But anyway, it was all happening at the shoemakers in Daylesford. Dear me. Patrick Casey corroborated his wife's evidence, and Mr. Godwin contended that the case must be dismissed. There was no evidence whatever of any attempt to provoke a breach of the peace. There was no challenge to fight. Now, the bench concurred with Mr. Godwin and dismissed the case, so very lucky for James. And it is interesting to note that the article above the one about James's trial in Kyneton was a report about one Patrick Casey resisting the police and actually biting a constable. He was so drunk he didn't know what he was doing. I wonder if this was the same Patrick Casey. We also learned from the case that James was born to Irish parents, which is quite interesting. And upon researching the surname Banigan, I found it is indeed Irish. I also noticed that James had grown. He was now 5'6", so it seems the Australian sunshine and healthier air have done him some good. The next time we find James is 8 years later in 1885 in the prisoners reported as discharged from the penal establishment's reports in the Victorian Police Gazette. Now that's a mouthful. Now these reports detailed information about individuals who had served their sentence and were discharged from penal establishments. These records helped authorities keep track of those who had been released back into society. James is in the Melbourne jail serving a 14-day sentence for larceny. He was tried at Fitzroy, probably at the Fitzroy Police Court, and I wonder what he stole. Was he having trouble finding employment? I don't know. Regrettably, he did have a tendency to steal. A year later, we find him at the Castlemaine jail serving a 3-month sentence for larceny. He now had grey hair, he was 57, and an additional tattoo, an anchor. So in convict tattoo speak, the tattoo symbolised hope. Unfortunately, he had also lost an upper front tooth. In October of 1887, he was charged at the Sunbury Petty Sessions for being drunk and disorderly in a public place. Fortunately, he was only cautioned and discharged. James was living and working in the Macedon Ranges, likely picking up shoemaking work wherever he could find it. A year later, he was charged at the Court of Petty Sessions at Gisborne by Constable Hart for being drunk and disorderly in a public street. He was reprimanded to Melbourne jail for 7 days for medical treatment. Now, by this time, James was likely in very poor health, especially with his drinking. But he did stay out of trouble for another 4 years while working as a bootmaker for a Charles Turner in Gisborne. However, in 1893, things turned very grim for poor old James. He was now 64 years old and still working as a shoemaker for Charles Turner in Gisborne, when in April he was given a 1-month sentence at the Melbourne jail for larceny at the Melbourne Petty Sessions. He was described as having a broken jaw. So what had happened? Did he fall over in one of his drunken fogs? Possibly. A month later, he was back at the Collingwood Petty Sessions, charged with another incident of larceny. He spent 14 days in Melbourne jail. I wonder what he was stealing and why he was charged down in Melbourne. Did he go down there for weekend benders? So many questions. Now, tragically, in November of the same year, James was found hanging from the doorknob of his lodgings in Gisborne. The inquest into his death provides a unique insight into his sad and, I believe, very lonely life. The inquest into James's death was held on the 18th of November 1893. The first witness was Charles Turner, bootmaker of Gisborne. He had employed James for the last 5 years at his bootmaker's shop in Arthur Street, Gisborne. James lived in a room at the bootmaker's premises. Charles said that he had last seen James around 4 p.m. on Friday the 17th. He said he tried to do some work, but he was unable to. He said he felt unwell. He seemed to be suffering from the effects of drink. He left the shop and went into his room, and I heard him there moaning at about 8 o'clock that evening. When I opened up the shop the next morning, I looked through a window into his room and I didn't see him in there. About an hour later, I looked through the window into his room again and I saw him in a seated position behind the door, and I thought something was wrong. I then looked through a little hole in the wall, so much for James's privacy, but anyway, where I got a better view, and I saw that he was hanging from the door. I went at once and informed Constable Hart, who returned with me and cut the body down. James had hung himself with a piece of hayband. Charles went on, I had no reason to think that he intended to commit suicide. The deceased was very much addicted to drink, and he had been drinking heavily during the last 10 days. So far as I know, James was not married and had no relatives in the country. He was about 66 years old. He was actually 65, I believe, but anyway. And he was born in Scotland and was a Presbyterian, which is interesting. His convict records list him as a Roman Catholic, so he may have had to change his religion to get work in colonial Victoria, and Australia for that matter. Charles Turner continued, "He had no money, no swag, and nor did I owe him any money." The second witness was a Charles Lidderdale Hommel. He was also a bootmaker, and Charles Hommel had known James for 30 years, and he'd last seen him at 3 p.m. the previous day. He said, "He came into my shop, leant on the counter for about a minute, and my man said to him, 'How are you?' And he made to reply but walked out. I did not notice anything strange about him except that he appeared to have been drinking." James was always very quiet in his manner, and during the time I have known him, I have never heard him threaten to take his own life. The final witness was Constable John Hart. John was a mounted constable stationed at Gisborne. He testified that he had last seen James alive the previous day at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He was walking along Hamilton Street, Gisborne. My attention was attracted to him by the way in which he was walking and holding his head down. I have often seen him walk this way after he had been drinking. I have known him about 4 years. He was always very quiet in his manner. In consequence of what Mr. Charles Turner told me this morning at about 9 o'clock, I accompanied him to his shop in Aiken Street, and in a back room of his premises I saw the deceased hanging by the neck. I cut down the body, and I saw there was no violence on the body or any signs of struggling. The verdict was as follows: hanging by his neck, such hanging having been done by his own hand, and there is no evidence to show the state of his mind at the time. James was buried in the Gisborne Cemetery in an unmarked grave. Here is the monument the Cemetery Trust have erected in memory of the unknown graves here at the cemetery. The Gisborne Cemetery is very well looked after, and that's for the lost children. And here we have the Adults Memorial, and it says the final resting places of 341 listed in the burial register who can never be identified. Well, we know one, James Banigan. We remember James as a forefather of our modern nation. James's life was shaped by forces far greater than himself. A boy cast adrift by poverty, sentenced to exile, and hardened by a system that knew little mercy. Transported as a child convict, he spent his youth under the discipline of Point Puer and his adulthood walking the hard roads of colonial Australia. Through labour, loneliness and struggle, James carved out a life where none was offered to him. Though his end was marked by hardship, his story stands as a quiet testament to endurance in the face of a very brutal world. May he be remembered with compassion and as a part of our extraordinary convict history.